So we're happy to have this opportunity to meet you all, and this is your opportunity to ask questions. If you have any questions.
I was speaking to Richard the other day, and he mentioned a meditation experience you had in Antarctica. A meditation experience you had in Antarctica, where you were surrounded by white, and you went to like a place that was very bright and white. He mentioned something, and I was wondering if you can expand on that a little. It sounded interesting to me, or if you remember that.
Vividly. Yeah, it wasn't Antarctica, it was the Arctic.
The Arctic.
And I had, Richard Smith invited me to visit the North Pole after a retreat at Spirit Rock. I gave a 10-day retreat at Spirit Rock, and during that retreat, I mentioned that when I went to live in the UK, in England, I had this strange kind of nimitta, or sign, of being at the North Pole. And it was all everything was white, and I was naked out on the snow, and there were wolves in the background howling, and everything was rather frightening in anything that you can think of being more horrible than being naked alone out in the snow at the North Pole with wolves and howling wind. But the actual nimitta was quite peaceful. I felt peaceful. I didn't feel fear. So I mentioned this, and after the 10-day retreat at Spirit Rock was over, he invited me and Ajahn Amro to visit the North Pole. So I never expected anything like that. But it's strange living in England. I began to, even in the city of London, we were in London for 2 years, and I experienced this incredible sound of silence. What I call sound of silence, this kind of empty sense of, it's very peaceful. And it surprised me because, you think of a city like London, and the Vihara was on a very busy street. But anyway, Richard took Ajahn Amro and Ajahn Yanarato, Japanese monk, and myself to Svalbard, which is as close as we could get to the North Pole. And so Svalbard is an island that belongs to Norway, about 600 miles from the Norwegian, most northern part of Norway. And we spent a couple of weeks there, and we used to go out in the snow on sleds, and they had, these sleds were pulled by motorized vehicles. We'd have reindeer skins and it's strange how you're sitting on ice and snow, and reindeer skins are really insulate you from the cold. So that's why I went there, and of course visually there's nothing to distract you. There's hardly any color, just shades of gray or white, and and just interesting when you're living here in California, a very colorful place, or in England, you've got all these distractions. But at the Svalbard, there wasn't just the whole feeling was of silence and peace. And a strange thing was when we stayed in a hotel in the town, the main town on Svalbard is called Longyearbyen, and Richard made reservations at a Scandinavian hotel there. So when we went to this hotel, I was being showed to my room in this hotel, and I saw two chambermaids down the hallway, and they were both Thais. So, I never expected to see Thais in such a cold place. But there were about 40 Thais working in Svalbard. And so they got together, like Thais do, and gave a dana and provided food every day. And so we had Thai food at the North Pole. And there's a reason why I found out, Norway has 50% taxes when you're living on the main land of Norway. A very highly taxed society, 50%. And so, but on Svalbard, they don't have to pay taxes, just to encourage people to go there. And at the end of the First World War, in the 1920s, Svalbard didn't belong to anybody, but there were, like, Britain was claiming it, and Sweden, and Norway, and Russia. So there's a Russian community on the island, and they had a League of Nations meeting in which they assigned Svalbard to Norway, and Thailand was part of that meeting. So Thais can go without a work permit to work and make very good wages as just chambermaids or masseurs or things like that. And Svalbard, that's why there were so many there, because, they could, like, Thai people go overseas to make money to send home to their parents, to their families in Thailand. So, and they always glad to see monks. They're totally surprised when I said it, when I could speak Thai.
You wrote a letter about 9 years ago to the Sangha, and you were talking about your relationship to death, and you had said that you'd lost your fear of death. You were no longer afraid of it, and it only produced a feeling of curiosity and an interest in understanding it as a large change in your life, that you were actually looking forward to it. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about that in terms of how that changed for you, or if it changed. I'm assuming that that perception or that way of seeing death has changed over the years for you, but I don't know, and I was just wondering if you could speak about that.
Yeah, well, especially at this time when my sister just died, and she's the closest relative to me. So my parents died in 1988, 1989. And then I've lived abroad for nearly 60 years. I haven't lived in the United States, so I've lost contact with my sister's children and so they just, and they don't seem to be interested in much kind of contact. But death is, because we're all going to die, and we take it so personally because, you're so attached, you're so identified with something that was born. And so, the first three fetters, Sakya Ditti, Sila Bhatta Paramasa, I encourage you to really contemplate, meditate on the ego, the social, cultural conditioning you received, and just like the third fetter, Vichikiccha, is like doubt, translated as doubt, which is always a result of thinking, attachment to thoughts. So, Luang Por Chah once, when I asked him what the word for crazy is in Thai, said someone who thinks too much. So I thought that was a pretty accurate kind of description. And, over the years, I really encouraged monks and nuns to really contemplate these first three fetters. Because through this understanding of these three fetters, that you realize the path, the stream entry takes place. So, as long as these three fetters are, if you're still attached in any way, even a subtle way, to the ego or cultural, social, religious conditioning or thinking, your thinking habits, then you can imagine the path, or, you understand it on the intellectual level. But what is it as reality? And so you're caught in these three fetters. They're all artificial, very, that's why you create the Sakya Ditti, the sense of a separate self as your reality. And so that, just in the simple scriptures of suttas, there's the 10 fetters. But stream entry Sotapanna is just breaking through the illusions of artificial conditioning. Like the rest are quite natural to the form, like sexual desire, anger, and all the rest are part of the experience of having a human body with senses that grows old, gets sick and dies. That's natural. That's just the way it is. It's not about cultural conditioning. It's the way it is for everybody in the world. And so the first three fetters are what give this sense of special personality, uniqueness, loneliness, fear, and death is, is, even though it's natural, because of our thinking process, we want to know what happens after death. How many times have you been asked, what happens what do Buddhists believe happens when you die, and so forth? So this is a fairly common question. And then in Thailand, they talk a lot about rebirth, reincarnation, next life. And but the reality that I've found is that death is, it's just the body that passes away, and the senses, so the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, then the body just lose their ability to function in consciousness. And so their nature is to decay once the they're dead. The physical organs of the body can't operate anymore, can't function. Then the body dies. But consciousness doesn't die. And so then you begin to investigate it. If I'm attached, I'm conditioned to attach to death, to the body, to the sense of ego, separate self, to all the cultural conditioning, social, religious, generational conditioning, because you aren't, like I always emphasize, like a newborn baby. It doesn't have an ego. It doesn't have a language to think or remember. But it's a human form in consciousness. So then as I was talking about previously, about the consciousness, sensory consciousness, which we strongly identify with. So in the five khandhas, Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara, Vijnana is consciousness, and that's impermanent. So consciousness, but is the body is consciousness in the body, in the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body, or is the body and the senses in consciousness? This is a good question to ask yourself. Because we tend to, especially the Western cultural conditioning, very much based on consciousness in a body. So in the five khandhas, that's referring to consciousness through seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking. But then does consciousness die? And then you begin to contemplate consciousness as one of the 6 factors: consciousness, emptiness, earth, fire, water, and air. And then consciousness has no boundary. It's immeasurable, like space. So you have earth, fire, water, and air all bound, have forms, color, and quality. But space has no form or color or quality other than spaciousness. And consciousness is what you are. Begin to break down the illusions of yourself and let go. Not that you get rid of them, but you no longer believe in them anymore. You're liberating yourself from the limitations of the 4 elements in space. So what's left is still awareness, and you've let go of everything. And so in the second noble truth, that's about the 3 kinds of desire. After you reflected on those 3 kinds of desire in your mind, that you're experiencing, not just analyze it or see it as personal, but know what it is. So then you have this insight into the second noble truth is letting go. So I've followed that for years, just letting go of everything. And then you reach a place where there's nothing to let go of. There's just silence. And at first, I refer to it as sound of silence, but it's not really a sound. At first I perceived it as a sound because I didn't know what it was. But it's in the stillness when you're not distracted through the senses or through the thinking process, then there's still conscious awareness that isn't bound by form, because it has no boundary. And of course, scientists and psychologists, there's so much interest in consciousness these days. It's a very, it's a big mystery to science, because they want to define something like that is here and now, that they really are, but they can't. They always think it's something they've got to, have words to describe it. And you can't describe it. You can say it's knowing the present is like, this is the best you can do. So awareness here and now, that is, then you begin to experience this. There's awareness, whether the thoughts are good or bad, there's still consciousness. Whether, you're feeling healthy or sickly, you've got COVID, you've got malaria or whatever, there's still this silent, beautiful silence that you can rest in, abide in. So it was just by exploring that, and like, this is what bhavana, Pali word bhavana really means, is this investigation, dhamma-vicaya. So that's what I encourage people to do, because is this Theravada Buddhism, does it really ask you to believe in anything? What is belief? And that's what, the belief is that you believe you're a separate person, that you're a male or female. You believe that you're American or Thai or some nationality. You believe your age, you are young or old. You believe in American democracy and freedom of speech and American Constitution. You believe in God. You believe in angels, or you don't believe in it. You believe there are no angels, and you can believe there isn't any God. So there's these controversies around whether God exists or doesn't exist between atheists and theists, but it's all based on belief, because believing there isn't any God is another belief, because we don't know. What do you mean? What do you mean by God? And if you think, well, I don't believe in God, you still don't know what, but it's just choosing not to believe what Christians say or even Buddhists say. So if you don't believe in anything, it's not that you're against believing, but you see the limitation of it, the suffering of believing in things. And that's why in this I emphasize now all the time to trust in awareness, because that's here and now. That's not a belief that I expect you to take on as a Buddhist monk, but it's a helpful suggestion because it is the way out of suffering. When you're aware, when there's awareness as your refuge, it becomes Dhamma, apparent here and now. Consciousness is apparent here and now, because that's what you really are. So that doesn't die. And so the body dies because it's supposed to die. And that's its nature. But if you ask if I'm afraid of death, the personal sense of ownership of this body is, it's functional. I still can respond to conventions and my role in the Sangha and so forth, but it's no longer attached to it because the realization of the deathless, consciousness deathless and Dhamma. So Dhamma now, before when I first started becoming interested in Theravada Buddhism, you take refuge in Dhamma, and it's generally translated as ultimate reality or ultimate truth, which are English words. But what is ultimate true? What is ultimately real? So you imagine some kind of, it becomes very abstract. And you don't really know what it means when you take refuge in Dhamma as a person. It's some kind of belief in ultimate reality or ultimate truth. But it's still Sila Bhatta Paramasa, it's still convention. It's still the fetters are still operating. So as long as those fetters aren't seen for what they are, and you're still looking for nibbana as some personal attainment or enlightenment or three-mentary, some kind of personal attainment, you can't find it that way. It doesn't have a form. It's not a sankhara. So then, if you can take Buddhism can sound like nihilism or annihilationism, because one of the quotes from the Pali scriptures I like to use when I must give desanas is Aparuta desang amatasa taura ye sodamanta bamunjantu satang. And it's an pronouncement when Buddha was enlightened. The gate to the deathless is open. Trust in this. So, it's a statement. So what's the deathless? And then you investigate. Death is a perception. The word itself is a creation by human beings. And then we identify so strongly with the form of the body that what's going to happen to me when I die? And the reality is nobody knows. There's no real me to die. There's just a body dying. So through this inquiry and investigation, you begin to let go of these conventional identities, because they're all false and unreal. The Buddha described them as soap bubbles or foam on the sea. They have no ultimate reality in themselves. Like the view of a soul or some kind of personal soul quality is an illusion. Might be a comforting one, but it's based on belief. So, and then you think, well, in Christianity, if you're a good Christian, you go to heaven, and that's very comforting, but then you might go to hell forever. So there's heaven and hell, and these are words created by human beings. And they have their counterparts in every language, So in Thai, you've got Sawan Narok and so forth. So, it's the best that ignorant people can use to explain the mysteries of life, such as what happens after death. And so, you can really manipulate people by saying, if you don't keep the precepts and you commit crimes, and you go to hell for eternity, and if you're a good boy and obey God, you'll go to heaven. And then you're conditioned to think that there isn't any God, there isn't any hell, and it's all just propaganda, fake news. And so then you it's just words. To me now, those are just words that are used on conventional explanations that people use who don't know, who have not seen, and not really understood and abide in the deathless. So this gate to the deathless, door to the deathless, I always found that inspiring, because I thought, I found that on a personal level, I was an agnostic, really, or a skeptic, and then I found just getting educated and living in California, Berkeley, and that you had all this kind of 1960s freedom, the hippie time, and hippie movement was forming in Ashbury Street, San Francisco. And I lived in San Francisco during the beatnik period in the 50s. And it was all interesting, kind of exciting to just kind of thumb your nose at conventional American white man's conventional conditioning, Anglo-Saxon white Protestant conditioning. So, so the beatniks were like deliberately acting, in ways that were shocking and unacceptable by white middle-class Americans in the 1950s. So in some ways, just rebelling against white Anglo-Saxon Protestant values is kind of fun when you're young, but it doesn't go deep, and it doesn't last, and it doesn't, there's a lot of suffering involved in it. So the whole idea of just follow your heart and experiment life, and life is a banquet, and just enjoy eating wonderful food for your whole life, because you can't really do that. Because life is about old age, sickness, and death. And, that's the way it is for everybody. And you can't, in Berkeley, I remember in the 60s, early 60s, you see old hippies in bars and that, in their 50s and 60s, just trying to act that role, and it looked ridiculous. Kind of pathetic to see, middle-aged, older men trying to just be a rebel for the rest of their lives. So then the interest in Buddhism, and I had for a long time, because that was one of the good things of the beatnik period, was there was this interest in Zen Buddhism. So death now is just a perception at this very moment. What is it? To me, personally, it's a perception that I'm conditioned to have. But my refuge is in Dhamma, which is deathless. So what's there to be afraid of? And then when you get my age, you know, you kind of, you know, the body's no longer a very pleasant condition to live in. So, you know, on my birthday, you know, Thai people always say, please live to 120. And I know they mean well by that, but I can't imagine anything worse. Because at 88, it's you know, like you're still fuzzy. My vision is I have to go in a few days to Santa Rosa to get they're giving me injections in the eye to kind of preserve what vision I have. But I'm just thankful that I can see what I do, you know, so when it's not personal, then there's no suffering in it. Did you say?
Yeah, I was, you mentioned like people treating life as a banquet and eating all the...
Could you speak up? I have a terrible...
People treating life as a banquet and trying to eat all the good food, like the mundane happiness and then the super mundane happiness. Can you speak a little on some of the tools you used to break away from that conditioning of seeking the mundane happiness?
Just be the witness of it. It's not this is oftentimes a problem for Western and Thai monks, really, because we want to get rid of greed, you know, and you become a celibate monk, and so then, you know, there's a strong desire to get rid of sexual desire, and like in, you know, when I first ordained, I was 31 years old, and the idea, you know, of just eating very little, I'd go on fasts all the time, and learned an ascetic life of the very Spartan lifestyle in Thailand, and so, you know, but it was all done with the idea that I've got to get rid of greed for good food or sexual desire or anger. You know, I thought, you know, kill your defilements. Ka kile in Thai, get rid of, they use this very strong language like kill kile, the kilesas. And, you know, that's how I was brought up, to kill kilesas. As a Christian, you know, I was trying to suppress anger and sexual desire and things like that. So you know, this part of the American Christian conditioning that I received, and then in Thailand they kept, you know, so talking about kill the kilesas, but Luang Por Sumedho never really talked like that. You know, it's the understanding kilesas. Understanding anger, understanding greed. And that isn't like getting rid of it or destroying it, but understanding it, you begin to see it for what it is. It's a sankhara. Greed is a sankhara, anger is a sankhara. Mental confusion, doubt, and worry are sankharas. They're all empty phenomena that when you begin to trust in your awareness, then your wisdom operates. Universal wisdom is a way, you know, through sorting it out and letting go of these, because these are all part of being human. Human, you know, the human forms, what are they? They're born. They have to eat. We have to eat food for the body to survive. So hunger for food, is that a kilesa or is that just natural? Part of the result of being born in a material form material form. Or sexual desire, what is that? These are sexual forms. They're for procreating the species. So they're, this sexuality is part of nature. And then when we think a lot, we get confused. And because Luang Por Sumedho was saying that a crazy person is one who thinks too much. And we drive ourselves mad with our doubts and worries and fears just through thinking. And so, like seeing through thinking, I, began to realize non-thinking, which is silent. And so then this was the path. This was the path that you can trust. The silence of conscious awareness. And if you're always trying to get rid of things, like get rid of anger or greed or anything like that, then you're caught in always resistance and suppression, and then with being celibate, there's guilt about it, and you can idolize bhikkhu life as a good bhikkhu is just full of loving kindness and compassion, so then one can feel inadequate because you don't feel loving kindness for everybody. And so this is why, the ego is a very vicious condition. It's always guilt-ridden and ranting about what you should be and what you shouldn't be, and they call it the inner monster, because it says anything. A thinking mind, you can think anything. Where in the silence of pure conscious awareness, there's no thought there, it's pure. So as long as you're attached to conditions, all conditions are impermanent and unsatisfying. So you can idolize purity and try to become pure as a person. You can't do it unless you fool yourself. If you believe you're the purest person in the world, that's the real ego. And or you're more pure than somebody else, is just fooling yourself. And if you grasp those kind of perceptions, you become arrogant and you look down on others who don't seem as pure as you are, where with your natural state is purity. So it's learning to realize your natural, what's natural, tammachat or dhamma, here and now. So like in trying to attain stream entry from the ego level, you can't do it. And that's why this investigation, this Dhamma Vichaya is so important. Sati, Dhamma Vichaya, the first two factors of enlightenment. So it's a real, like this life that you're leading, is a real opportunity to investigate for yourself. Not just try to find out what others say or teachers say, but you're given the right to use these conditions, these traditions, Dhamma Vinaya, to investigate conscious awareness into the conditioning that you identify with. So it's, rather than trying to become a stream enterer, or to attain some kind of ideal purity, these are perceptions that you create. They're ideas. And what you find out is you're originally pure. Anyway, there's nothing to find. It's just letting go of what the delusions that you've been conditioned by those first three fetters.
Thank you.
So when Luang Por Cha would point out people's, or maybe not point out people's faults, but I've heard you mention before that it was difficult to live with Luang Por Cha in the beginning, that you developed resentment toward Luang Por Cha at times, but that it was ultimately beneficial. And how did he actually do that?
Well, he was a very, I felt really, with Luang Por Cha, for the first time in my life, by an adult male, I felt totally accepted. And so even with my parents, I felt that, there's always conditions about how, in terms of love and things like that. But when I was married, and that was very conditional. So Luang Por Cha was like, suddenly I felt this great kind of freedom. And so, and even though you're living in a very strict Vinaya monastery, the anger and resentment that I had, or anger towards Luang Por Cha, was just obviously just my ego. Because I had, he would, like sitting papia, with one leg on one side. Americans don't ever sit like that. And so and he'd give like 5-hour, 6-hour dasanas in the evening. And so, I thought, well, this isn't fair. I don't understand the language. I have to sit there in this painful posture for 5 hours. And I don't understand what's going on. I just feel pissed off. so I went to Luang Por Cha and I pleaded with him to, when he was giving a talk, if I could go back to my kuti. And, it seemed reasonable. To me, it was very reasonable. He said, no, you have to stay. And I thought, you're not fair, you don't understand. But, there was a point to, what he was doing for me was helping me. Because during that time, I really saw so much how I'd create aversion just because I was in pain or bored. Or my critical mind would start operating. I don't agree with this. This is just superstition, and grumble, and I'd listen to this because he was always pointing out to pay attention to what you're feeling. And so I really, I started developing that because it's a way to survive. And in that situation, otherwise I would have left. But then you have insight. You realize this, which is aware of anger and restlessness and boredom and exasperation and feeling offended, feeling misunderstood. They're all, you begin to observe them as a witness, as a puto, as a witness of them. And then they cease. So it's a way for condition to let go of conditioned phenomena without suppressing it. This is what I call understanding it, by letting it be what it is. So I remember a big insight I had during that time was I was having to sit through one of these long desanas, and I was really, I'm fed up. Absolutely fed up. I can't take any more of this. And I listened to this thing, this voice inside that said, I'm fed up. And I realized I wasn't fed up. That awareness doesn't get fed up. Suddenly it was this whole sense of, I can't stand any more of this, but I could. I'm doing it. So it was like a real insight. And I think I believe Luang Por Sumedho really see that this was good practice for me, because it's also a way to be part of the Sangha and listen to the language, and you pick up all kinds of words, and so you ask time up what this particular word means that you hear over and over again. And one of the Thai words I kept hearing Luang Por Sumedho talk about is Yutman Turman, and that's clinging. And so, I couldn't understand the meaning of it, and so I asked another monk about it, and said it's like letting go, blowing on. And so, because clinging, so the insight is to let go. I look back at that time, but I feel nothing but gratitude. Because, it's I saw it as, here I'm living in northeast Thailand, where I don't know anybody, and the Thai people are so eager for me to get enlightened. They bring food every day. They got all this support for enlightenment that I don't have, never had before in my life. Then you think in Thailand you got a nation of Buddhists who I assume all want me to become enlightened, because they're very fascinated the fact that this American would ordain in a monastery like Wat Pah Pong, because it was in 1967 when I went, and the Vietnam War was at its height, and there was a huge Air Force base in Ubon. They built the airfield. That international airfield in Ubon was built by the Americans, and there were all these airmen, American airmen, zooming around on motorcycles, and they had nightclubs, whorehouses, everything. It was just rampant kind of Americans are, just into sensuality. And then Elvis Presley movies were very popular in Thailand. So they had this idea that Americans just lived such a happy life, dancing on the street, singing. And why would you want to live in Wat Pah Pong? And so, there was a lot of interest. I mean, I was the first Western monk there, so I'm fine. Outside my kuti, villagers standing outside waiting for me to appear. Object of intense curiosity.
I'm wondering, are there any certain habits, practices, or standards that you had over your monastic life that you found was most helpful for developing?
Yeah, well, like Anapanasati is good in the beginning because it calms the thinking mind. And so like samatha practices are helpful in the beginning to give you something to grasp, and you kind of, you're still sending your attention to outward, to an object such as the breath or to a casino or whatever. But then in vipassana, insight meditation, you have to investigate the Four Noble Truths. And so the first noble truth is suffering, dukkha. So that's to understand that. And then the intellect says, well, I know what dukkha is, I suffer enough. But then you get the impression, because there's three aspects to each truth. And the second aspect, there's suffering, understanding, and then the result of understanding. And understanding is observing suffering, wanting to get something you don't have, wanting to, even when you're doing samatha meditation, there's a lot of, I want to get jhana, I want to get still, I want peace, and bliss. You think of bliss as a desirable, to be in a very peaceful, blissful state is a very desirable idea. But, so as a person, seeing yourself always through the Sakya Ditti, the personality, when you're actually observing your own doubt or guilt or worry, what is it that's aware of doubt? And I found, like my personality I don't like as a person to feel confused. So I was brought up to try to get answers to every question, solutions to every problem. And then in the training at Wat Pah Pong, I found it a little confusing because I didn't understand the language, and in a different culture, totally different culture than what I was used to, and I didn't know what was happening half the time, what they were talking about, or what to do next. And I was always being told how to behave and corrected by other monks, and I feel resentful towards that. Just being told how to walk or sit or behave, and because the ego doesn't like that. It likes to, I was older than most of the monks at 31, and they were all farm boys with 4th grade education. I was well educated, and so these perceptions would come up, and so I just started observing them through this Buddho, to be the witness. So I recommend trusting your ability to just be the witness, not somebody witnessing Dhamma, but just witnessing it like this. So suffering, like being here at Abhayagiri, the kind of problems that arise in your mind, living in community life, in the Vinaya, and the weather changes and so forth, to use it as to be witnesses like this. Whatever you're feeling, you can't help the way you feel. None of us can. Feeling is so personal, and you may want to feel loving kindness towards everybody, but how do you really feel at this moment? So then that's Buddho, witnessing the way it is Dhamma. All conditions are impermanent. So I also encourage people to not believe what they're thinking. To observe thinking as an object rather than try to think about not thinking. So, and I found, people really suffer by believing their own thoughts all the time. And so, because we have critical minds. When you look at the ability to think, language, like the English language, it's based on dualistic perceptions of right and wrong, heaven and hell, good and bad. So it's a critical function that, in your education, your cultural conditioning that's reinforced, to develop reason and logic and the thinking ability to think. And, but feeling, emotion, isn't reasonable or logical. You can idealize, you'd like to have loving kindness for all sentient beings as an emotion. That's an ideal. And ideals don't have emotions. So it's very high, very good, very beautiful. But what are you feeling right now, at this very moment? Only you know. It's like this. It's not about judging it as you feel good or bad or whatever, but whatever emotion, mental state you're experiencing when I'm talking to you like this is like this. So that's witnessing. It's non-critical. It's not telling, so it's not nagging you or begging you to feel inspired and believe what I'm saying. That's the thinking mind. But it is the way it is. Whether it's what I say confuses you or inspires you or makes you feel critical and averse, it's like this. Because you can't help, feeling. This is a feeling realm. These are feeling forms. They're all about emotion. And so, so the weather, when you observe the weather changes, or day or night, you feel differently. When you're with people you enjoy and love and like, it's like this. And when you're with people you don't like, it's like this. And so you can't like people you don't like as just some kind of willful idea, but disliking is like this. So everything that you feel, you're the witness of, and therefore you're not the feeling. You're not bound by that feeling or the critic of it. You're not criticizing yourself for feeling averse to somebody you should love, but it's, if the feeling of aversion arises, it's like this. So you learn the way of insight into the way things are. All conditions are impermanent. So it's like these metta practices, like the may I abide in well-being and so forth, and being a skeptic and a cynic. I used to, when I hung Sakito Homi, when it was in Pali, I just memorized it and went through it. I didn't quite understand the words, but when translated into English, my cynical mind said, may I abide in well-being, and God, I don't like that. Because it seems so kind of, I felt negative towards just, may I abide in well-being. May all beings be liberated from suffering. I could kind of go along with that. And then I noticed that it was easy to spread metta to 7 billion Chinese in China who I don't know than the irritating monk sitting next to me. So I could spread loving kindness to 7 billion Chinese, but someone sitting next to me, I just feel irritated. So I began to, some people love metta practices because they're very inspiring. But what is metta? Loving kindness, and it's your true nature. It's Dhamma. It's natural. It's not some kind of ideal condition that you generously spread around the world, like it might sound. But we're all the same consciousness. The 7 billion Chinese, the monk that's irritating you, the consciousness, me, you, it's the same consciousness. So you begin to see consciousness has no boundary. And we're all of the in consciousness. So then there's a sense of loving kindness that's quite natural through conscious awareness rather than just intellectual idealism. So, and then you begin to, because one of the questions in Thailand, they never talk about, like the word love, and then in the West, love in Thai translation, it tends to be about loving this or loving somebody. But then in Christianity, mystical Christianity, you've got unconditioned love, which is not personal. And then metta is unconditioned love. And consciousness, when it really begins to, you begin to realize this for yourself, then metta for all sentient beings is natural. It's not a kind of ideal creation through thinking. And then the sense of a feeling of loving kindness towards every creation itself. And then you realize, in the Nibbana Sutta, the first stanza of the Nibbana Sutta is this kind of heart sutra of Mahayana. And and that makes no sense intellectually. It's complete nonsense if you try to figure it out just through a Western intellectual mindset. But when you begin to have insight, then there's 4 stanzas in the Nibbana Sutta. The first one is something like the Heart Sutra. And then I remember when I was in the Peace Corps, I was sent away to London for these books, all on Zen Buddhism, and they chant the Heart Sutra. And so I read the Heart Sutra. This is, it doesn't make any sense at all. I don't understand it. And the sun, moon, and stars are in consciousness. And all space is in consciousness. Now, just on your Western intellectual conditioning, you can't imagine that. The sun and moon seem so far away, and the stars, and the whole universe, and galaxies, and who knows where's the end of the universe and space. But in the Buddhist scriptures, space is one of the immeasurables. You can't measure it. It has no form, but it's here and now. So you can perceive space. Like you would just, I can see space right now. There'd be no ability to see any of you if there was no space. We couldn't exist without space. Forms can't possibly manifest by themselves without space. So the forms, these bodies depend on space for manifesting, and what manifests dies, changes. So, that then the consciousness, which you can't find, you can't perceive, because that's the perceiving ability. So it's like trying to see your own eyes. You can't look at your own eyes. I mean, you look in a mirror, and then that's a reflection of your eyes, but a direct experience of seeing your own eyes is impossible. You can't find yourself as an object, because any object is a creation. And so personality is just a creation. But what's left if there's no personality? And can space possibly manifest if there's no consciousness? So in the sequence, you've got consciousness, space, they're immeasurable in the forms. Anicca, dukkha, anatta are earth, fire, water, and air. So explore that. Like, these bodies are all about earth, fire, water, and air. They're forms in space. They come and go in space. They can, things arise and cease, manifest and demanifest. And without space, there could be no forms. So earth, fire, water, and air come into space, and it gives a possibility for manifestation. But space and the four elements are in consciousness. So that always brings you back to the here and now. Because right now, Santipiko, Akarika, Ehi Pasko, Opanayaka, Bhajatang, Vetira, Bhuvanyu, we take refuge in Dhamma, here and now, apparent here and now. Consciousness is apparent for all of us. But we don't notice it because we're always trying to find it or define it. So the puto, the witness, is merely a word for a technique to point to the reality of here and now. It's like this. When these words, it's like this, notice it's still words, but it's non-judgmental. There's no judgment in it. It's not about good or bad, right or wrong. And this especially applies to your emotional habits, because the thinking mind is critical. If you're critical of yourself, it's because of emotions. You feel fear, and if you're a real man, you're not unafraid, and you have personal problems or doubts or obsessions that arise and cease, and you want to get rid of them. But and then the critical mind, logically, it's good to get rid of the anger and greed and be a normal person. Just, be a healthy, normal person. But what is that? When we talk about in American English about a normal person, I've often wondered what that really is. What is a normal person? One who kind of fits in, into the American dream, and doesn't have extreme emotional problems, just kind of goes along with life. Is that normal? You know that you're still thinking about a normal human being as something, you know, something that you're not. Because emotions, what's normal about emotions, they can change according to other conditions. You know, so if somebody starts abusing you, you know, you're going to feel angry. Anger will arise because the conditions for anger are there. It's natural to feel when somebody's insulting or physically abusing you. It's like this. You feel angry. And anger is like this. But that which is aware of anger is angry. And that was a real insight for me. It was, I can feel angry as a person, but Puto, the awareness, the witness of anger, isn't angry. So where do I take my refuge? In my habit of getting angry because somebody said something I didn't like? Or in awareness of it? Then there's no suffering. So you learn, you know, from being criticized, being blamed, even though none of us want to be criticized or blamed for things, you know, so we like to always get along and be friends and get praise and be appreciated, you know, it's a desirable state, and being vilified and rejected is, nobody wants that. So these are the personality, you know, it's like that. It's very conditioned and dependent on other conditions. But what isn't conditioned is conscious awareness. That's why it's a refuge. So for me now, the refuge in Dhamma is something real. It's no longer just ceremonial chanting or, you know, believing in something called Dhamma. You realize Dhamma. You know the knowing, direct knowing of Dhamma here and now is like this. It's silent, it's peaceful, it's not critical, and it's not personal. It's anatta. So it's all there, and you know, like this is my own personal experience. That I particularly taken the Four Noble Truths to heart as a samanera and as a bhikkhu. And then Ajahn Chah to me was the ideal teacher because he was always referring to the Four Noble Truths when I began to understand Thai and so forth, I really appreciated his insights into how to use these truths for investigating. And investigating is like, it's an encouragement. You're not told what to believe, or, you know, in Vinaya you've got rules about behavior and speech, just to get along with it as a group. You know, if we didn't have Vinaya to hold us together, we wouldn't be able to live with each other for very long. And because we, like hippie communes in the 60s, they're based on ideas of freedom, personal freedom, and do what you want. But living like that in a community is really frustrating. I visited a hippie community in England, and you know, they rented a beautiful, stately house in Kent, And they invited me. Some of the members of this hippie community were ex-monks that I knew. And so they invited me for a meal. So I went to this kind of beautiful home in the countryside, and there were all these hippies, practicing meditation. The meditation room was a real mess. They didn't believe in Buddha images. They thought Buddha never had any images, and we're not going to have Buddha images. So there was no focus in the meditation room, and no kind of order or anything. The blankets, hippies sit with blankets around. They're all in piles on the floor, and one of the women who I knew was really bitter about having to wash the dishes because nobody else bothered. Then it was about free love, and so there were pregnancies, and within a year or so the whole thing collapsed. Because it was just impossible to live like that. The ideal, they were all idealistic young people with good intentions, but no wisdom. So that we're in this, even in Wapapo, just, how did I manage to get along with the monks? In the later when I didn't understand half the time what's going on is due to the Vinaya, really, which holds the community together. So, like when you're ordained, you're given the right to live under this discipline, not to take it so personally, but to be able to use it to action and speech, because that's all the Vinaya is about. It's not about emotions or thoughts. So there's no abati or that with the thinking bad thoughts, because sometimes we can't help but think bad thoughts. Our emotions, anger and fear, jealousy, and that arise, and it's like this. So in this way, all the conditions are teaching us, this is where wisdom operates. Universal wisdom, not personal knowledge. And it's very well contained in this Sape Sankarani Cha. All conditions are impermanent. Sape Tamanata. All Dhamma is non-personal, not a self. So the first fetter is the biggest obstacle we have, the ego. And so rather than trying to get rid of your ego, you understand it. It is an artifice. It's not reality. You aren't what you think you are or believe you are. That's not what you really are. So, whatever you think of yourself is a creation of the mind. Habit, it's habit. You acquire a sense, when you're born, then you're told you're a boy, you're American, you're, a good boy or a bad boy, or you're loved or you're a nuisance. So you acquire a sense of a separate self through, you're not born with it, but it comes through the family, the mother, the father. And that's all artificial, because it's not what you really are. So, I found it such a relief to realize I'm not what I'm thinking. So, the thoughts, still come. I can still have personal thoughts, egotistical thoughts, but I don't believe in them anymore. They seem empty and useless.
Or could you maybe talk about a little bit of your experiences with Luang Por Liam in the early days and some, maybe some stories with him, or he was kind of just a little bit senior to you, so he would have taken you under his wing a bit at Wakapong. And is there any?
Yeah, he came. I first went to stay at Wakapong 1967, and I was the 22nd monk of that Pansa. And Ajahn Chah was getting well known in Ubon, but not like in Bangkok. Nobody ever mentioned him. So it was, and the monastery was very basic. Now what Nepal has electricity and tap water, but then it was just, every afternoon we had to draw water from the well in kerosene tins, and there's no electricity, no mosquito netting. Just we had individual mosquito nets, but no screens on the windows. So the food was pretty coarse. You're getting mostly village food. And I was at the end of the line, and then the following year, there were about 40 monks. And several years later, Ajahn Liam came. So I forget how many. The first few Pansas, he wasn't there.
Oh, he wasn't there yet. Okay.
And Ajahn Mahamon, you know him?
Yes.
He came later, and he was a Pali scholar, very respected in Ubon. He was a Pali language teacher, and that's a very high position in Thai society. So there was quite something for a Pali scholar to come and become a disciple of Ajahn Chah, because all the other monks were farm boys. They did fourth grade education. And so Mahamon was the first kind of exceptional. And then Maha Sumpong came. He was a Pali scholar. And then Ajahn Liam, he had about 9 pansas when he came. And he's rather dark-skinned and slight, and I noticed some of the monks dismissing him. But when he would give talks, Dharma talks, by that time I could understand the language. They were really profound. And I noticed Luang Por Chah always liked to get Ajahn Liam to give talks. So on these all-night sitting on one pra, I really like to listen to Ajahn Chah and Ajahn Liam, because I found their teaching so helpful to me personally. But Luang Por Liam doesn't, where Ajahn Chah was very much outgoing, as soon as you came into society, he'd kind of embrace you. He'd look at you and smile and talk to you, and Luang Por Liam just say, "Good morning, Ajahn." So, yeah, he still does that. He's not very outgoing, but he's very wise, and his Dhamma is really from inside. He's not a scholar. So he kind of, like, contrast to Luang Por Cha, the bullying kind of wide open, loving kindness Ajahn. Luang Por is more upekkha than metta. And then Luang Por Cha obviously realized that Luang Por Liam already had taken meditation retreats in Bangkok. There was a monastery in Bangkok that taught meditation, and he lived at that monastery. And so, I felt right from the beginning he already had insight. So I felt very attracted to him right from the first time I met him. And then one time we went tudong together, and he's really tough, physically, and I've got very big feet, and the Thai sandals, those thong sandals, I could never get a pair long enough, so my heels would hang off the back of they give me Thai-size sandals. And so going tudong with these sandals and following Luang Por Liam, he was unstoppable, but I had a hard time keeping up. And then we spent a night in a forest down in Upper Det Udom, a really creepy forest. It was really cold season. And there was no shelter, and these cold winds were blowing all over the place. And I remember curling up under my, it's too windy to even put up your umbrella, your coat. So you just sat under a tree and put on your sangati and everything and got through the night. And we went, I can't remember how many days in northeast Thailand. Went to his home village, and there it was, I realized what a humble background he had. And it was, then one time, another experience I had with Luang Por Liam was there was a man, well-intentioned army officer, like a colonel, had this grand vision of, because Ubon borders on Cambodia and Laos. So there's a point in Ubon where Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand all come together. And this army officer wanted to build Buddha Rupas, have Buddha Rupas established, one facing Thailand in the peace gesture, one facing Cambodia, and the other towards Laos. And so he came to Ajahn Chah, wanted him to support this. So Luang Por Chah sent Luang Por Liam and myself in an army helicopter to this area. And we landed in some remote place on the very borders of Laos and Cambodia. Spent the night, and I don't think anything ever came of it. It's just I never heard anything afterward. it was one of these brilliant ideas. So I always felt, this kind of respect for Luang Por Liam. And when Luang Por Chah became ill, then Luang Por Liam took over the abbotship of Wat Pah Pong. And a lot of monks left, and a lot of monks didn't felt jealous or didn't like Luang Por Liam. People were complaining about him. People would come to me and say, I was in England at the time, when I go back to Thailand, they say, Wat Pah Pong is a ghost town. You've got to do something about it. And Luang Por Chah was still alive. And one year when I returned to Thailand, I went to see Luang Por Chah. He had this special kuti separate from the main monastery. So I went and paid respect to him, and then I went into the main monastery to his old kuti, where, brings back many memories. They had this image, lifelike image of Luang Por Chah sitting on a bamboo seat with his cane. He had this cane like this. And I sat there and meditated in front of this image. And I thought, I like this image better than the reality of it. Because Luang Por Chah, when I go see him, he kind of, you could tell he knew what was going on, but he couldn't respond at all. And, personally, I didn't want Luang Por Chah to be like that. I wanted him to be like his old self, like the lifelike figure under his kuti. And just watching that in my mind, just seeing how, how the mind creates these kind of biases or impressions. And then I walked around Wat Pah Pong, and it was all dusty, and hardly any monks were living there. And it had a sense of it being a ghost town, a monastery where nobody wanted to be. And so, I felt very sad. And the following year, I came back the following year, and it was bright and clean, and monks began to discover Luang Por Liam as their teacher. So the monks that kind of rejected Liam left, and then the monks that came that year, between the sad year where the ghost town existed, in a year's time, it was, it was being rebuilt, and clean paths, and a lot of disciples of Ajahn Liam were there. They were there because of him. Because he endured through all that, through the criticisms, the loss of monks, the Luang Por Chah's illness, which lasted 10 years. He just really surviving, learning always from the experiences that he has to have in that position he's in. So you can't feel nothing but respect for somebody like that. That even when he was being criticized by senior monks, by lay people, to this day there's still monks criticizing Luang Por Liam. And he doesn't criticize anybody.